Alright, yeah, so if you're, I'm going to just Dynamesh this sphere. So a lot of times, like, accessories can sometimes be a little difficult in ZBrush. I'm going to switch to a regular dam standard or standard brush. And if you want to make something like a shoe, a boot, you know, something like that, sometimes it can seem a little intimidating to build more sort of hard-edged objects or hard surface objects. And ZBrush does allow you to do it in a way that is fairly quick. So I'm going to just start with the boot shape by going to the brush menu, grabbing an insert, cylinder, insert cylinder, turn off Shift F here, and I'm going to just use my move tool to kind of scale this out. So right now this is sort of masked, right? I'm going to go to the draw tool, use a move brush, and then I can start kind of nudging this in to kind of get a shape, right, for a boot. And then I can flip. So if I control tap off the model, that allows me to actually start to create some shaping here. All right, so just like anything we do in ZBrush or in 3D, we can start with fairly basic, you know, shaping essentially. I'm going to give this thing a bit of more of a real shoe boot feel. And at some point too, you know, I'm working in symmetry, but I do eventually need to kind of break out of symmetry. And so I can control tap back and forth to kind of get some of the different shapes working a little better. Maybe smoothing and then pulling things down, just so that they overlap. So keep in mind, this is in Dynamesh mode. Let me turn off symmetry, control tap off the model. And now I can kind of pull this thing in, pull in, right? So we get, I guess this would be more of a right boot. And let's get the heel shape working. Maybe smooth this out a bit as I go. All right, so we get something that looks a bit more foot-like, right? And I may also use clip curve. Actually, instead of using clip curve, I just want to show you this. I'm going to hit Shift F, which is polyframe. If I just use a clip curve, that will give me kind of a flat boot area. I actually want to start to strategize by using polygroups. So I've shown you guys how to polygroup and organize your model in a way, and that's really, really helpful. But it can actually pay off if you start working with polygroups pretty early on, because you can turn polygroups into very quick UVs in ZBrush. You can use it to quickly grab individual fingers. You can use it for a bunch of stuff that's really, really powerful, like remeshing, creating a new low-res mesh, that sort of thing. So instead of using clip curve, which allows me to kind of create a flat area to this foot or shoe, I can actually go into B for brush, T for trim, and use trim curve instead. So what it actually does, clip curve actually just would flatten that area against itself, against that line. But trim curve will actually give me a new grouping here. So that's actually a fairly important aspect to this tool. Now, this is by no means perfect, this boot or this shape. Let me just flip around here and just tweak this a little bit more. You know, generally speaking, you do want to get your shape down well first. That's kind of an important thing to, you know, making a good shoe, good hands, gloves, whatever it might be. But for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to move forward here. So what I can do at this point, I'm going to, since Dynamesh is active up here, I'm going to control click and drag, which will Dynamesh all this stuff together. Not once, but twice. So remember, when I did an insert, it masked the sphere, and I was just kind of using that to tap back and forth. So I'd either mask the cylinder or the sphere to get my shaping. So I did hit control click and drag once to clear the mask, a second time to actually merge the two surfaces, right? And then I can sort of smooth them. Again, I would advise you to really fix your shapes first, get the shapes down well, and then Z-remesh. Again, for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to move ahead. This is not the prettiest shoe or boot, but I'll move on. So if I go to Z-remesh now, remember if I hit Shift F, I've got a couple polygroups here, right? I've got the bottom group, the middle kind of boot area, and then sort of the upper boot. I may in fact actually go back and use trim curve again, just so I can quickly make another group up top. Another way I could do this is very simply by control clicking and dragging and then hitting control W. So let me try that again just so I get a different color. So right now you're seeing, let me turn off the line option. So I've got a group up top, right? A group on the bottom, and then two groups for the kind of boot area. Now you could, in theory, also, I may plan ahead. I'm going to Control Shift click on this. Control Shift clicking on polygroups is a quick auto hide. And so if I have something visible or masked, I can say Control W and make a new group out of that. If I want to put a kind of tongue into this boot, well, maybe I can Control Paint down here. Let's do something like this and hit Control W, right? So I now have some polygroups. And if I turn back on the line option, I'm going to Z-remesh this. Let's say I need a fairly low poly count. So I'll go to maybe 1,000 and hit Z-remesh, but turn on polygroups. So this will process and then give you new edges and topology based on those, the borders of those groups, right? So once we get this Z-remesh done, we'll see we've got some half-decent polygroups now, right? They flow with the foot. They work pretty decently. If you're, sometimes the results are a little bit kind of off in some spots. I may just say, you know what, let's retopologize again and keep the poly count roughly the same and Z-remesh the second time, and maybe it'll clean stuff up. And it actually usually does. It gives me a pretty clean result. Okay. So next step, if I'm, again, just doing something really basic, I may just go to B for brush, Z for Zmodeler, and you can hit M, which is the little shortcut up here for that kind of combo for Zmodeler. And I mentioned Zmodeler before, but basically if you hover over a polygon, whatever function you were last using, I think by default it's set to extrude a single poly, so extrude single poly. So when you go hover over a polygon, it extrudes it. If you hover over an edge, I believe it'll insert or bevel, depending. And if you're hovering over a vertex, it might allow you to stitch. What's great about this, it's like the Maya toolkit, and you have to hit space bar. So you've basically got your polygon actions or the editing actions, and then what group it affects, and then essentially there's like a modifier group. So there's action, the target of that action, and modifier. But this all depends on what you hover over when you hit spacebar. So if I hover over edges, in this case I may want to delete a few excess edges in the top here, and I can say instead of deleting a single edge, let's delete a complete loop. So I can simplify that upper edge up here, and it's really, really quick, right? If I hover over vertex, I could say let's slide a vertex around. So maybe I can slide some vertices along the surface. So it's keeping the surface shape but allowing me to slide them. So I can do the same thing with loops. Let me just undo that a bit. So I'll hover over edge, and I can say let's slide a complete loop. So I can space these out a little better, right? So this is a really, really great kind of simplified tool. Really gives you a lot of speed, a lot of power. It doesn't, I think, for me, it doesn't give me everything I need, so a lot of times I will have to export to Maya, but let's say I'll delete a couple more loops in here just to simplify this. Eventually I may delete this whole interior polygon, but let's say I want to extrude this and give it a bit of thickness in case the camera can look down into the character's boot. So I can go hover over poly, hold space bar. I want to do an inset, which is like a flat extrusion. It might be set to single poly. I'll show you what happens with that. So I think on the default it'll be on something like this, where you inset a single poly to the center for each poly. It'll do this. Or if I go to poly, let's say poly group all, it'll do something like this, which is not what you want, right? I want the whole island, so I want to inset the poly group, but I want to inset not each poly, but the whole region. So this is kind of the modifier to the target. So I want to inset the whole region, which will do this. Now I can go into extrude. Again, I want to do a poly group. Usually I just go to poly group all, and then I can extrude down, right? So that's really, really useful. And then if I wanted to, I could say, well, let's hover over this, hit delete, polygroup all, and delete that polygroup because I don't necessarily need the rest of the inside of the boot. You know, the leg will be fit in there, and we won't see the rest of those polys. I'll come back and do something very similar, I guess, to the bottom part of the boot here. So I'll go to, I'll do an extrude polygroup. We'll pull this down. And then I can do this, by the way, so this creates a new group here. Sometimes with polygroups, when you see it create a new polygroup, or let's say you mask an area, so I'll mask this and hit Control W, right? It'll make a polygroup. A lot of times it gives you a different color. Sometimes the colors are so similar, it's hard to tell. So sometimes I'll isolate it and hit Control W and then unisolate, just so I know. So Control Shift, by the way, is your quick access to hiding and isolating groups. It's really, really fast. So if you're working with fingers, I often will make each individual finger a polygroup, right? So I can quickly isolate it, move it, rotate it, and sometimes I'll go joint by joint. I can show you maybe an example on another older project. But so remember, I'm still in extrude mode. I'm going to extrude out from here, right? So now I've got this little kind of boot shape. Now, again, what's cool about this is I can, if I go to either move, rotate, or scale, and Control tap on a group, it isolates it and masks all the others. So if I feel like I need to move the boot down kind of over that area a bit, right, it protects the other polygroups, and so I can get more of a hugged area there, you know, that's a little more fitted to the boot. Control tap off, and we invert this. So now maybe I can move this part up, or this tongue down, right? So I can, you know, start doing some shaping that way. Last step, you know, if we hit, by the way, in ZBrush, there's sort of two systems for smoothing mesh. One that I've shown you most of the time is just to divide, 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 right? That gives you multiple levels of division for sculpting. If you want to preview something for use in Maya, though, there's a second section called Dynamic Subdivision. And so when you hit number 3 on the keyboard in Maya, it actually subdivides your model twice. That's the equivalent of hitting divide, divide twice here, basically, in the division panel. But I'm going to undo that. You can hit Dynamic. Okay, so apparently there's some mesh issues here. So let me just go to Fix Mesh. So if we hit Divide, it kind of gives you a Maya-style preview of what the mesh will look like. So sometimes I find that very useful, and I'll just switch it back off. What I often will like to do, though, for stuff like this, so some of the stuff needs to be curved, other stuff needs to be harder edged. Again, we go back to B for brush, Z for Zmodeler, and hit M for Zmodeler. Hover over edge, and I want to actually bevel edges that need to be hard edge. So we bevel a complete edge loop. And yes? It's spacebar. So spacebar activates when you have that particular tool, the Zmodeler brush. You have to hold spacebar, and it activates the sort of options menu. Now, I think by default it's set to single row. A lot of times I like to keep my original edge and have 2 rows. And you can also keep it on sharp edge. So what that'll do is, it is creating a new polygroup, but it's going to basically create 3 loops where there was 1 before, right? And that's going to actually, now when I go to dynamic, sorry, let me just, for some reason there's some mesh issues here, but let me just hit Fix Mesh, and then I'll go to Dynamic. So now when we see the dynamic, right, we get kind of this sharp edge. Yeah, I guess there's some bugs for some reason in this mesh. There's some openings or tearings happening here, but if you do ever notice that, by the way, there is kind of a quick fix to this. If we go to Modify Topology, you can try to go to Weld Points, and as long as the threshold's low enough, it should get points that might be split, but like right next to each other. If you crank the distance down and go to Weld Points, you might start collapsing down some vertices that you don't want to collapse. So just be careful of that. And if I crank the distance really, really high, you see it kind of collapses down some stuff I don't want to collapse. So usually a very low weld distance. And let me go back to dynamic here. Again, there's something really weird with this particular model that I've been working on, but again, this is something that might be fixable as well inside of Maya after. But Let's just divide this once or twice. There we go. So this allows you to kind of keep some creased edges, okay? And we can do the same thing sort of in the upper boot area as well. So we could, you know, go in and kind of add a creased edge up here if we wanted to, a beveled edge, sorry, and kind of maintain some firmness. And if you want to, you know, sometimes I want to preserve certain polygroups. So for instance, these two groups for some reason are linked together. I can actually isolate these. So I'm going to switch back. By the way, when you activate clip curve or a trim brush, so that's B for brush, T for trim. If you activate any of the trim brushes or any of the slice brushes, so that's B for brush, S for slice, you're actually going to activate this. When you hold Control Shift, it converts or activates that trim, that clip curve, or that slice brush. That's what it's activating when you hold Control Shift. So if I want to actually break things up based on visibility, I can go to Select Rectangle, and now when I hold Control Shift, I can isolate the visibility of that group, hit Control W, and now it's sort of split off from this other one that it was sort of connected to. So a lot of times I'll do that too with these beveled edges. I may want them just to be one group. These two bottom polys here, these two poly groups, I actually want them to be part of the same one. So I'm going to just isolate, again, let's just do this on visibility, and then I'll hide these upper groups. So I want these two groups to be the same. Hit Control W. Now it's one poly group. Okay. So polygrouping is really, really powerful. It allows you to do a lot of stuff really, really quickly. And so, you know, you can keep working on this. You know, maybe I might want to delete these extrusions. So I could go in and do that. I'll go delete polygroup. So I can just go delete this, delete those guys. So the reason I'm doing this is so that I can maybe work on extruding the tongue. So now I go to extrude, polygroup, there we go. And then we extrude that inwards like that, right? So, you know, for some of you guys, you might think, you know, it's actually really fast for a lot of stuff. And it has some advantages over Maya. Can it get a little messy? It can. But you can also remesh and fix stuff very quickly and then send it out for a final edit in Maya if you want. Okay? So I just want to show one last thing. So I did a sculpt kind of referencing one of my favorite artists' works. And what I did is I basically brought in this low poly mesh and isolated. Again, this is what I was saying about polygroups. Sometimes they're very, very similar colors to each other. So sometimes I'll isolate them and hit Control W so I get vastly different colors. So what's great about this is that when you're working and sculpting, I had these set up, and then if I Control tap on a group, I can now just rotate the individual finger, right? So set up the pivot point right where it should be, and then I can kind of rotate it where I need it to be. And that works at low or high res. So if you're working in high res, right, you can do the same thing. You can start to pivot. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, right, you can actually get in, isolate each individual digit, and start to polygroup each digit. So now you can actually get some real good kind of flexing of each kind of joint. So I'm holding Control Shift Alt, by the way. So Control Shift is a visibility. Alt will hide. So the green will allow you to see only what you select, and when you hold Alt, it'll remove what you don't want to see. And remember, as soon as you switch to a clip curve, a trim curve, that Control Shift is now, instead of activating visibility, is activating a slicing or trimming or a clip curve brush. So just keep that in mind. It's a little tricky, but as most things in ZBrush are, it's weird, but it's wonderful at the same time. So yeah, that's what really allowed me to kind of pose the hand correctly and actually to individually sculpt. So I could actually say, you know what, I just want to sculpt that finger and get in alongside of it, and then position it so it's actually got correct contact with the other pinky, right? So now I could get in and do that really intricate stuff. The other beautiful thing about this sort of system let me just show you guys this as a quick bonus, right? So maybe I'll undo the separate polygrouping on the individual knuckles here just to show you maybe a more typical unwrap. But let's say I have this hand and I want to start creating textures. You can go to Z plugin, UV Master, and I'm going to go to basically say work on clone. So it's going to actually clone the tool. So it keeps my hand and moves that subtool off over here. You can see that. And then I'm automatically selected to the clone copy that I want to work on. I'm literally just going to go polygroups, unwrap, done. If I go to flatten, I can see what it looks like in a UV workspace. It is done. I'll now go back to unflatten. I'm going to copy the UVs, jump back to the hand that actually has subdivisions. I believe that's this one. Is that right? Yes, it is. All right, so I've got that. I can now go down to my low subdivision, and I want to actually paste the UVs onto this low res. So now, if I want to make a texture map, a UV map, in this case I've only got sculpting, so I don't have any texture, but I can say let's do a 4K normal map, and you want to switch to your low subdivision for this, create normal map, and check it out, it'll create normals based on those UVs. So polygroups are immensely, immensely powerful. This is why I say ZBrush is the best. If you want to challenge me on it, go right ahead. But you can get 90 to 100% of the way there in your projects in way less time in ZBrush than you can in Maya. Maya is great to get really refined topology, to fix a lot of edges, to get rid of triangles, to make sure things look really good when they're smooth. But there's just a lot of stuff you can do really, really quickly in ZBrush.